Hey everybody, it's Leland today with Cut to the Chase reviews. I'd like to do a review for you all on the Buck 830 Marksman. It's a really slick knife that I think is a little underrated, so let's go on and get to it. Okay guys, let's go on and get into the stats. So for the overall length, we've got an 8.25-inch knife. It's pretty comparable with knives like the Benchmade Griptilian, which, sorry, it's dirty. That's my daily user. And just a tad smaller than the Spyderco-Mannix, even though it really doesn't look like it in the picture. But regardless, that compares with the knives that I'd like to compare it to the most today. And then we've got a blade length of 3.5 inches, so that leaves 4.75 for the handle. It's a definitely not a small knife, but it's really a good knife for people with larger hands, or working gloves if you like gloves, and just if you really kind of want a big edge. So that helps with that. And then of course Buck's signature, very deep ground hollow point. It does well on this knife. Don't really have anything else to say about that. A lot of knives are like that. Even comparably, the Benchmade Griptilian has a little bit of a hollow grind there. Buck always brings it really close to the top spine, which makes it absolutely fantastic and blows everybody out of the water in terms of slicing. I mean, you have such a thin profile to get all the way through anything you're cutting before it starts to interfere with that thick spine. So that's definitely good for slicing. And then for our steel, very unlike Buck, but definitely welcome, we have a 154 cm, which, again, like the Griptilian, which is its probably most popular competitor in this price range, which I'll get to that in a minute. It's also 154 cm. This is, of course, an older model. The new Griptilians are S30V, which is a superior steel. But I'll get into the steel a little bit more, but quickly, I really do like this steel. Buck has a really fantastic heat treatment called BOS, and honestly, or Boss, I've heard it both ways, but they do that for their 420 high carbon steels, which are definitely lower quality than this 154 cm. So I was very, very happy to see that, because honestly, I think that's probably my favorite overall blade steel. I'll explain that again, like I said, in a little bit. One of this knife's party tricks is that it has ball bearings, which I'm not really going to be able to see in there, but anyway, there's a tray here and here with ball bearings, and it gives this knife an unreal level of play. But the best part about the way that this fancy lock is, which again, get into that, is that it just completely locks up. There's no blade play. So those ball bearings are absolutely fantastic, and compared with this flipper, you can just, it's like, it just teleports open almost, which is just absolutely amazing, because not many knives are really even look like this, so I think that's pretty neat. And then, of course, Buck is famous for making, I'm going to estimate about the majority of their company is made in the US. They have a few really cheap knives that are unfortunately Chinese made, but of course Buck in tradition will tell you very, very proudly, which I totally understand, that it is made in USA. So that's definitely a pro. And then we have Buck's forever warranty. With any kind of Buck, you get a forever warranty on any kind of defect or issue that comes up with their knife. Of course, just wear and tear is a little bit different, but their warranty is great. Buck's service is honestly better than anybody's service I've ever been to or called with, so it's great. Speaking of the box, nothing special. They'll tell you, what you got, Marksman. The one thing I will note about the box is that they do give you two Allen keys, or Allen wrenches, however you call them. And that is for this lock adjustment, which I will also explain later. But the fact that they give you these keys is just a really nice, unnecessary, they didn't have to do it, but they did it, which was very helpful. And they gave you two in case one of them strips out, I guess. So very nice. Box, not much to look at, but then again, box is better than a clamshell any day. And then there's no liners on this knife. and that is because it is an aluminum knife. Now, Buck is not unknown or any kind of new maker for aluminum scales or aluminum frame knives. They've definitely done that even on some of their cheaper ones, but the aluminum on this knife is very well done. It's milled very nicely. It even has a little bit of rounding on those cups there, so it's not a very sharp aluminum, which is nice because a lot of times if you have a sharp aluminum, it'll really start to wear out your hands. So this aluminum is strong enough and thick enough, you can see, to where they don't actually need liners, so that's nice. And it also prevents any kind of tolerance issues putting that pivot in, so very good. And then, like I said, it's aluminum, so the overall weight's going to be a little bit more. It's about 4.3 ounces, which is Buck's, that's what Buck says it weighs. And it definitely is a little bit heavier. I mean, the Griptilian's light because it's that FRN, which the aluminum is completely superior to the feel of this FRN. So I would say the Buck definitely has an advantage off the start with this aluminum to begin with, but definitely lighter still than the Mannix 2. This thing is a tank with the G10 and the full steel liners. So right in the middle, not bad. We'll give it to him. Okay, guys, so let's go on into points because this is really where the review takes place. So first thing I'd like to talk about is this lock. It is called the SLS, I think, Strong Locking System. Yeah. So anyway, what this lock is unlike anything else. But essentially, it is just a metal tension bar, okay, and that strap on the back moves up. And when this knife swings around, that little clip there hooks onto that strap, and it holds it in place. So in theory, for this knife lock to fail, there would have to be so much force on the back of this that you completely shear off these screws to pull it forward, which is very unlikely, especially since they have that little safety block in there. So they claim that this is one of the strongest knife locks on, in the business, which personally I'm not exactly sure if that's super logically true. I haven't dealt with a ton of knives that have boasted that kind of strength before, but I will say that it is extremely strong and by far the strongest knife that I have. I've got a few knives, and like the Axis lock is a big one. This ball bearing lock that Spyderco does is very strong. Both great lockups, but this thing is on a new planet. It gives such a tight lockup that it feels like a fixed blade. And I never say that about a folder because it's never true except on this one. It's just such a tight lockup. I have absolutely no play. And what's neat is that Buck also knows that this steel right on the business edge down in there on the leading edge where that knife actually runs over that edge and locks up is going to, fatigue. It's going to wear out. It's going to bald a little bit. So that's what these Allen keys are for. And essentially what you do is you take these out. We'll just go on and pull one of them out. And when this knife starts to get play because of that, and that metal starts to wear out, you stick this key in the back here, and you find your pin hole, and you actually screw this tight, and what it does is it brings this entire strap back, and it tightens up your lock. That's just fantastic engineering. I mean, that is absolutely phenomenal, and the fact that they thought through that really shows you the level of engineering, especially in the future engineering that they made this knife with. And to me, that's really satisfying to know that they thought about that. I have not had to do that yet, and I have absolutely flipped the hell out of this thing. So I don't know how long you'd actually have to wait before you have to start messing with that, but the fact that it's there is just kind of satisfying. So then we can go on to the opening. So like I said, this is a ball bearing knife. And actually, because of this kind of action here with this absolutely just butter kind of floppiness with that blade until it locks up is one of the reasons why I pinned it to compete against the Benchmade and the Spyderco, because both of these knives have very similar but not as good action. So this one, you can see I'm doing it. It moves, but it doesn't move as much. There's still some friction in between those liners, and mainly because both of these have bronze bearings. This is the only one of these three with brass, or I'm sorry, with ball bearings. So that's really the reason for this knive's kind of characteristic, right? Now for the Spyderco, I would say that the Spyderco probably comes in second in terms of floppiness, but absolutely still nowhere close to this buck. So that's really a neat point. Now, one thing I would like to say about this knife is that when compared to these three, that's again why I brought these three out. I found this knife for like $97, and that was like, I couldn't pass it up. It's absolutely phenomenal that I found this for that cheap, because this knife generally goes for about $115 on, you know, Blade HQ or like pretty famous knife places that do great deals to begin with. So I think I got this at Midway for that cheap. Now these knives, I got this as an older model on sale. So, you know, you can pick up a Griptilian, a full size like this. All of these are full-size knives, but you can pick up a Griptilian for about, you can find them for under 80. You're really going to have to hunt, or it's going to be last year's model, and that's exactly what this was. So price-wise, it still doesn't beat the Grip, but if you're buying all new knives at, like, market price, this one is still going to be cheaper, just because these Grips go for about $115 to, like, 94, I think. So and then of course the Mannix, just primarily because the blade steel is S30V, which is superior to both of the 154s, even with Buck's heat treatment. You're gonna find these, I got mine for 110. I think they run for a little bit more than that. You can look, like I said, just look around for the best price, but this one's generally going to be above 110. So this one's going to be the most expensive, I would say the most, especially with the G10. This is the higher of the two models for the basic Mannix 2 that you can get. So the Buck is priced very reasonably for these three knives, is my point for that long, drawn-out explanation. But essentially, you know, like I said, this one is so up to par, well built, well engineered, that it was very clear that Buck was trying to get their foot in the door away from their like $60-ish knives, which are great, but there are definitely $60 knife competitors, into the $100-ish competitor range, and they did that very well, I think. So that's my point for those. But now let's focus back on the knife. So like I said, with the opening, there's not too much blade play. I will get into something. There's a big point I'm going to make here in a minute about it. Actually, there's no blade play now that I've kind of touched up this, you know, tightened it a little bit in the middle here, even when it's locked up. But just the fact that it's so smooth with that kind of lockup is, I mean, there's really not much to say about it other than it's fantastic. So that's good. For centering, you can see that it's, you know, almost perfect. I have scuffed it a little bit, but, you know, it's got a little bit of play, but that's not super difficult, and you really would have to push it over to rub on those aluminum scales. And that's something to think about, because that aluminum is much more abrasive than, say, like, you know, this plastic on a knife. So, you know, if that bothers you, then you definitely might have to tighten it up a little bit. And of course, when you tighten this bearing, or this, I'm sorry, the pin more, it's going to prevent it from having such a fluid motion. So definitely something you can prevent that blade play from, but it's also going to take away from your features. So now we're going to move on to the handle. I would say scale, but of course this knife has no scales. So this kind of, it's anodized, this aluminum, or at least I believe it's anodized. It might just be straight up coated. But either way, it's good. I don't have too many aluminum knives. But the ones I do don't have this kind of matte abrasive texture on it. And I will say I like this abrasive matte texture better just because it's not as slippery. And I don't think that shiny aluminum looks particularly expensive. And I think that this matte looks a little tougher. I think it's just a little bit more abrasive and tough. Now, I will say, you can see here, this is just from me wearing jeans, I think, and taking it in and out and rubbing on that, the corner pocket little stud or whatever. So it definitely does come off. It's not something I can like scrape off with my fingernail per se. That just actually took off some of my fingernail. But anyway, you can definitely see it'll wear out eventually, but aluminum doesn't rust. It's, not something you got to worry about with it. Like, oh no, you're exposing it to the elements. So not an issue. It's just more cosmetic. So cosmetics definitely come second as function, and the function's great. Now for the clip, now one thing I think that Spyderco and Benchmade definitely messed up on is that these are not deep carry clips. You can see how on both of these knives, I'm going to use this bag as an example. When you do this, your knife is going to show above your pocket about that much for both of these. This G10 is probably going to be a little bit harder to get under there. Oh, easier. Okay, well anyway, so you see, both of these you're going to be able to see that. And in more, let's just say touchy areas with touchy people, people noticing that you have a knife and not just like a pin clip is maybe not the attention you want to bring to yourself. So in a lot of ways, these deep carry clips that Buck is really famous for putting on pretty much all of their knives are 100% a plus. So again, that's another point I would make. Out of these three from the factory, Buck got it. It definitely has it on that. Now, might as well just point this out. There are a few things on this knife that quality-wise should be checked. One of them is this stamp. So Buck's little anvil, while it's neat and I like the thought of it being there, they kind of shortcut lazy butt stamped it. It's like part of it's almost completely flush. Like they almost like the press that stamped that in there was cockeyed. And because of that, it looks kind of, just doesn't look very good. And I think that they should have pushed it a lot harder to get that more deep in there. Now, if they're going for a more airy look and it not so like prevalent, I can understand that, but this is not the way to do that because, like I said, it's not even. That's one of the issues I would have. The only other issue is that you have a little bit of pitting on this little pressure cutout here. It's just essentially so that it's not as hard to lift this lock up, because if that was a solid spine, it would be really difficult and you would kind of have an uneven bending. So that just essentially makes it so that it bends straight in the middle of that thinnest point. And when they did that, you can see there's a little bit of pitting, which is a little weird because it's like it's almost like a structural issue. Like I said, I've not taken this thing and like ripped it out. I'm sure if you did that, you would bend it. But at the same time, it doesn't look that great. So I probably would just keep in mind about that. Other than that, this knife is quality-wise is built pretty good. So those were my only two predicaments with that. Get rid of these. Like I said, clip's great. It is a true pocket deep carry, so it goes all the way up there. Not much to say. I like how it's bolted from the top too, and it doesn't bolt on the side, or it doesn't go inside of the scale. I hate when knife makers do that. I just don't really think it's that strong. But I like it on the top here. I think that looks kind of interesting. Okay, and then let's go on to the blade. So like I said, 154 cm is fantastic. I'm surprised Buck did it, generally because they're like a not so great or great. They've got 420 high carbon, which they put on everything, especially the venerable Buck 110 and 112. Or they've got their higher level knives have S30V, like this Spyderco and the newer Griptilians. They kind of went in the middle of the ballpark. I will say that, like I said, this is an older model, so if this is going to compete, which I don't really think at this point, it's an older knife. They still make it, of course. They still sell it, but it's not been updated. for a while. They have done a few different versions of this, but I think only one of those versions has a higher blade steel. It's the S30V G10 model. But if they're really going to compete, but much more expensive, totally out of this price range, it's, I think, closer to 200 if I'm not mistaken, even more. But, with this being upgraded to a S30V currently, and this being an S30V, they are a little farther behind in blade steel than the competitors. And that might be for the reason the price is generally a little bit cheaper than the others. But now I will say, with knife making, any kind of steel making, not even just knife making, heat treatment is everything. And this Boss heat treatment, it honestly makes it feel like S30V. And bringing it out of the box and cutting things, if I want any of my knives to cut something and have the cleanest, sharpest, most precise cut on my life, I pulled this one out. Because whatever Buck did, it might be a combination of just the way they sharpen, because Buck generally does send pretty sharp knives from the factory. But this thing is insane how sharp that this is for a knife out of the factory. I'm not saying that this is like the sharpest knife in the world, but I'm going to say out of the factory, where most people just kind of do a quick run up, touch up, you get an edge, and then you send it away. This thing is absolutely great. Best sharpening job out of the factory I've ever had on a knife. So definitely good on that. Now, there is the biggest issue with this knife I have. Disclaimer: everything's been all, great up until now. But where I really honestly considered sending this knife back at once, and I was so upset with it, is this pivot. So, just basically what happens is, as this knife rocks back and forth, you flip it, you're constantly doing this. This pivot works itself loose. Now, the biggest issue I have is that it's preventable, okay? Benchmade, when they make their knives, they have this bolt is not a circle bolt that goes through the middle. It looks like the cross-section of a D. One part, usually the bottom here, is flat, and then it's round at the top. So what that does is when it mates up with this scale and the metal liner on the inside, it prevents that bolt from moving once it's in there. And the only way that you can keep this bolt in there is to tighten it down. So when it's tight, it won't undo itself, essentially, because it doesn't move. It's got that little flat spot to keep it from rotating. Buck didn't do that. I don't know why, especially on a knife that is its biggest party trick is that it flips a lot and it moves. They didn't do that. So essentially what happened was, within an hour of me taking this knife out, it was Christmas Eve, super happy I got it. Literally, I played with it for an hour, and then I literally could have taken this and spun it and taken the pin out. It loosened itself so fast and so much that the blade I could take it and go like this, and the blade was wobbling back and forth. I could hear it. That's absolutely unacceptable. And like I said, the way that they should have prevented that is either made some kind of geometry in that hole to prevent the actual thread and cup from moving with the blade moving, or put a hell of a lot of Loctite in there, which they didn't, or they did and just have really poor quality Loctite. But anyway, the way I remedied it was taking out the pin, putting Loctite in there, shutting it. I let it set for 38 hours. It was a long time, and then I opened it back up again and did it for a while, and the same thing happened. So I was like, oh my gosh, I can't use this knife, because it just, that looseness, and knowing that every time you open it, which is the reason most people get a knife, is loosening it is just a terrible feeling. So I opened it, put Loctite in there, and then let it set for a week. I mean, I didn't touch it, didn't open it. I think I even left it in the open position just so that it would really get a good lock. And it hasn't had a lot of issues now. I used to be able to take this thing and move it in the middle because the whole, cylinder will move. But now it's locked up. I haven't had an issue and the lockup's good. But if I were you, when you get this knife, if you do, really just address it off the bat. Buck did a pretty poor job of keeping that screw together and from moving. And if it's something you can definitely remedy if you really love this knife, and you want this to work like I did. You just have to really put Loctite in there and not touch it, and just practice restraint for a long time and let it settle in there. But like I said, when I did that, I definitely love this knife. It's one of my go-to carries, and I think it's a good knife once you get past that issue. The only other thing I've had, which every knife kind of has a little bit of an issue with, is that there are some spots you don't want to stick your fingers. Of course, one would be right in front of the business edge, right? But the way to close it, I've found, is not to at first I was kind of, every time you get a new knife, you kind of have to figure out the best way to hold it and to close it. And you're not very fluid with it, but I would try to hold it and then pull it up with my thumb. And you can do that, but it's not as slick or cool. You can't do it with one hand, but so when you open it, of course, just like a flipper, you just push that back, super easy. But then the way I found is that you take your oh my gosh, middle finger and your thumb, and then you pinch that spine, and then you take your other two fingers, just rest in there, and then you take your pointer finger and just push the knife into itself, and as you're pulling up with these two fingers, and it's pretty easy. The only thing is that sometimes if you're not careful, you can catch your skin on this grabber here, which also utilizes this back lock it's not a back lock, I'm sorry, the spine to hold itself shut. So you see when you close it, it actually pulls that bar up and holds it down. And you can't, well, you can hear a little bit. Yeah, definitely can hear it, but it's no more than a Griptilian, where you can literally just fling it open without touching the blade, which you can on this, but it's going to take a lot more force. But those teeth there in between where that cup grabs this spine, if you're not careful and you got your finger in the way, it can definitely grab your skin. So that's not fun. But other than that, you touch electric fence, you won't touch it again, kind of thing. So you just know not to put your finger there. So now, for those who have either watched it and just want to recap, or those who have skipped right to the end to see good and bad, here are the 3 good and 3 bad. First, starting with the 3 good, I think the look is fantastic. One of the coolest knives I've got. The name, Marksman, is super cool because guns are awesome, and I think Marksman is just a really neat name for a really neat knife. And, the name is a lot. It when you talk about a knife and you're like, yeah, I got a Buck Marksman, it just sounds pretty cool, I think. So look plus for sure. I like the detail. The blade shape's cool. This little finger groove is unique. And then I think that back lock, while it's very interesting and it's kind of weird to have that pass through there, it just looks unique and cool and unlike anything else that I know I have, and most likely most people have. The only thing I would say that I don't particularly care about the look is all of the Buck logos and that G&G Hawk, which is definitely cool. They were a collaboration that helped design this SLS lock, but if they scaled all that stuff down a little bit, something more subtle like, the Benchmade logo, which to say Benchmade, saying Benchmade is subtle is ridiculous, but compared to this, it is. So another plus, the second plus would definitely be the blade. I think the profile is fantastic. That really deep grind is not maybe for everybody's taste cosmetically, but functionally, which is the important part, it's just phenomenal for slicing and cutting, especially if you use this for a camp or cutting apples or tomatoes or, whatever you want to cut, that's going to be your, best blade shape. And then the lock. I think the lock is fantastic. I've never had a knife lock up that tight, and I've had some pretty high quality knives that this just completely destroys out of the water. And then, I think once you get the hang of it, it takes a little bit to get used to it, but once you get the hang of it, it's really a slick knife to use. So that's a good thing. Now for the bad. The bad, number one, bar none, the pivot. I've never had any aspect of a knife frustrate me more than this pivot. Now once I got it fixed out with that Loctite, It's not been an issue. I haven't had to think about it, thank God, because I've been able to focus more on what I like about it, but I definitely had an issue with that at first. I wish Buck had redone the geometry on the inner circle to not make it a circle, but they didn't, and that's fine. I mean, I just think that they should reconsider that for knives that utilize ball bearings and knives that people are going to just naturally flick all the time. So other than that, that's all I have to say about the pivot. The second point would be fine details. Just like I said, this little pitting here, not a great quality point. Not an issue, I don't think. While it might have some structural issue, hopefully it doesn't really protrude very deep. I don't think it does. I think it's more tertiary, but I definitely think that little things like that and this Buck really light stamping, it just looks kind of not up to par for the knives that it's going to. I mean, when you compare it to like Spyderco, I think, in my opinion, has the best tolerances. Their lines, the way they cut things, their milling is the cleanest, and Spyderco has no issues like this. So if Buck really wants to compete, I think they need to just finely tune a few different things, especially the fine details, which is what people who like knives look at the most. You know, you sit there and stare at all these different lines and the G10 texturing and the jimping here. That's what a knife collector is going to do. And, you know, when you look at this with a really fine eye, you see things like that. And it's kind of like, it's not quite to that level, right? So other than that, not a big issue. And for the third thing, just the logos. I don't particularly care for this. I like a little bit more subtle feel. Even the Spyderco's got some pretty big logos, but other than that, for the Buck, you know, it's not terrible. It's not a turn off, definitely, but it could be better. If they had just said Buck, maybe had the B instead of Buck, which I think they should have just kept the B. And then the USA, of course, always like USA on my knife, but just a little much. But other than that, guys, that was my review for the Buck 830 Marksman. Let me know what you think in the comments. If I were you, I would go and pick one of these up. If you're a collector, you're looking for a knife that's well built overall, functionally wise. It's a super, super unique, very cool looking knife. And really just from a brand that is famous for being made in the USA, which is of course fantastic. I think this is a super good competitor for a lot of those $100 range knives, which is about the max a lot of people are willing to spend on a knife. So this is a contender. I want to thank you guys so much for watching this review. Let me know what I can improve on or what you'd like to see more of in my reviews. And I really hope that everybody's doing okay in this time with the virus going around. And as always, God bless America. Thank you guys so much.